All right. I think that we should start. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this seminar with our speaker, Professor Michal Deckel, who has written a book that it's one of those rare books that has scholarly rigor and heft, but tells a story that captures a large audience. Tehran Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. Hold it up to see what people can see. And I will introduce Professor Deckel very briefly. And then I'll talk a little bit about the format. So Michal Deckel, interesting person, not only being a professor of literature, but also with a background in law. She obtained a law degree and worked in the field in Israel before deciding to pursue the much more lucrative field of English and comparative literature. Smart choice. Professor Deckel teaches at the City College of New York and the CUNY Graduate Center. And she also directs CCNY's Rifkin Center for the Humanities and Arts. Now, Tehran Children, as we'll hear, it does represent in so many ways a departure for Professor Deckel. She previously had published a book called The Universal Jew, Masculinity, Modernity, and the Zionist Movement, and a very interesting book that I think is only available in Hebrew called Oedipus and Kishinev. She's also published on a wide range of topics, including George Eliot's Hebrew translations, which she and I have actually corresponded about, tragedy and revenge in Israeli literature, and autism in the English novel. So this book, Tehran Children, is a departure in its subject matter, in the disciplinary tools that it required, and most strikingly, in the relationship between the scholarly and the personal, something that's quite clear not only in the story itself, but also how it is written. It is one of the most gripping, well-written books of history I have read in many years. So let me just talk about the format. Michal is going to share a presentation and she'll be speaking for half an hour or so. Then there'll be plenty of time for discussion. And especially because we have a large group, we have 50 participants, it's very important that we use the Q&A function, which you have at the bottom of your screen. You do not by any means need to wait until the end of the presentation to submit your questions. Feel free to submit questions as Professor Deckel is speaking. I will be following them, tabulating them, putting them together, and I will pose them to our speaker and she will respond. So we can have a very a good and robust Q&A session. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Michal. We very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Derek, for this wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you, Vasilis Koutifaris and Michael Barrio and the crew at the Center for European Studies for the invitation and for making this happen. Of course, I would have loved to see you all in person, as Derek and I planned, I guess, for April last year or this year, but a few months ago. But you all know what happened, and I hope that the medium nonetheless is allowing some of you who are not in the area to join us. I look forward to your questions and your comments. As Derek said, the book came out in October 2019, and since then I've given, I don't know, 30, 40 talks, and in each talk I learn new things from the audience because people know things that I didn't even know when I wrote the book. So that has been quite wonderful. I feel like I should be writing a sequel after this about things I have learned. So the title of the talk today is Tehran Children on the Trail of World War II Refugees in Central Asia and the Middle East. For those of you who don't know, and I assume many of you don't know, the Tehran children, or Yaldei Tehran in Hebrew, were a group of nearly 1,000 Polish Jewish children who were evacuated from Soviet Central Asia to Iran and later to Mandatory Palestine, where they arrived in 2 waves in February and in August 1943. So as Derek said, this is also a personal book. Among these Tehran children were my father, Hanan Untitled, who was 15 when he arrived in Israel, so just almost 13 when the war began. He arrived with his 11-year-old sister, and they were raised, like many of the Tehran children, they were raised in a kibbutz in Israel, a collective settlement, and basically became Israeli citizens after the establishment of Israel in 1948. I was born and raised in Israel, and For various reasons, which I talk about in the book and which we can discuss, I had very cursory knowledge of my father's wartime experience. Like many survivors, and perhaps particularly survivors who survived in this way, he never said anything, and I didn't know a lot. And so my trail after these refugees in Central Asia and Iran really began with my trail or my journey after one refugee, who was my father. But the book took me in a very different direction. First of all, ended up taking a very, very long time to write, over a decade of research and writing and travel. And it ended up sort of veering, I would say, from the traditional memoir and from the traditional second generation memoir in general. During this decade, I traveled and researched in Poland, in Russia, in Uzbekistan, in Israel, in various archives around the world. I had a colleague who researched for me in Iran. I mean, I have an Israeli citizenship, so even though I have an American citizenship as well, it didn't feel safe enough to travel to do my own research, but I did have people helping me, and I worked in multiple big and small archives around the world. And in the course of this travel and research, I ended up writing a book that accounts not just for the history of my father, and not even just for the history of these nearly 1,000 Tehran children, but really of roughly 250,000 Polish Jews who survived Nazi extermination in Soviet Russia, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, India, and Palestine. So it ended up becoming a very big book that pertains to a lot of people. I also wrote a book ultimately that tells the story of Christian Polish refugees, of aid organizations, and of host communities around the world. And so I ended up unearthing a story or history that belongs to a great many people, but actually hasn't been the subject of a lot of research, or barely any research, and certainly not the subject of commemoration and representation in popular culture. And as we know, in the last, I don't know, 3 decades or so, there's been an explosion of work, both scholarly and popular, on the Holocaust. But somehow this story, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, has fallen by the wayside. So one of the things that I've learned since the book has come out is the importance of the power of narrative. Because since the book came out, I started getting emails from many people, and those emails usually begin with a sentence, "My father was in Uzbekistan during the war, and I thought he was the only one." Now, I just told you that there were 250,000 people, Jewish refugees in Central Asia, and many of them, most of them in Uzbekistan. And this really brought home to me the importance of having a kind of framing narrative for the past. And so if this person would have learned suddenly that their parent was an Auschwitz survivor, they would have known what that meant, even if the parent never spoke. They would have read Primo Levi, they would have read Art Spiegelman, and Elie Wiesel, and so on. But here, a person discovered that their parent was in Uzbekistan, like, what were they doing there? How did they get there? Is this really true? And so on. So somehow, somewhat unintentionally, my book became that book that provides the framework for a lot of other people's stories and histories. So let me, I'm going to speak for about half an hour. Let me first rehearse quickly the route that these refugees took, and then I'll maybe talk about a few questions that were important to me and that came up during my research. So I'm going to share my slides with you. This is the cover of my book, and this very quickly is these are the heroes of or the protagonists of this story, and of course there are many other protagonists, but this is my father Hanania and his sister Regina and their parents behind them. This is probably less than a year before the war. This is in the town called Ostromyzowiecka in Poland. They are a kind of bourgeois family, generations long owners of a brewery and in a kind of middle sized Polish town. In September 1939, like hundreds of thousands of others, they flee from the approaching Wehrmacht forces into the Soviet Union. And this is more or less a map of Poland as it gets partitioned between Germany and Russia and the Soviet Union. On the Soviet side, whether people fled there or they just simply lived in those towns that fell under Soviet occupation, are about 1.5 million Jews at this point. Of these, that hundreds of thousands are deported to special settlements and gulags in the Soviet interior. In the case of my father, to Arkhangelsk. And if you look at the map, and the map is very important here because it helps you appreciate the kind of crazy, tremendous distances that these people traveled and these children traveled. And those of us who have children know that it's very hard to get them to walk from one block to another. So they start out here in Ostromyzowiecka, and then they are basically deported to Arkhangelsk at the kind of northern tip of Russia, and they're transported like many others for hard labor, and if they survive the transports, which were in themselves very difficult, and the punishing labor and the extreme temperatures in those areas, they remain there for about 14 months, sometimes more, but most of them remain for about 14 months. In June 1941, as we know, the Wehrmacht invades the USSR, and those seemingly luckier Polish Jews who were not deported and remained on the border are basically killed, or they're ghettoized and they're later killed. But those who were deported are essentially, as we like to say, were saved by their deportations, because the Wehrmacht doesn't make it far enough into the Soviet interior to kill them. Instead, Polish citizens, including Polish Jews, are released from the settlements by a special amnesty from Stalin. And again, when I say released, I'm talking about the majority. As I researched this, I realized that there are many variations. There are people who are not released. I mean, this was not exactly the age of the internet where you knew what's going on. I mean, it could have an individual commander of a camp who would just say, no, I'm not releasing people. I'm not telling them what to do. But in general, people were released and continued on to, if you look at the map, basically continued for the most part south to Soviet Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. I mean, this was a second exile in the sense that this was the Soviet Union. You couldn't just go wherever you wanted, but it was not an organized transport. In the Soviet Union also, we have the formation at that point of a Polish army in exile under the command of General Władysław Anders, one of the high-ranking Polish generals who was not killed in Katyn and was sort of taken out of a Moscow prison, sort of cleaned up and basically put in charge of a Polish army. And when that army is allowed to leave the Soviet Union and to evacuate to Iran under the auspices of basically the British forces, they take civilians with them. They mostly take Christian Polish civilians, but some Jewish civilians are allowed to go as well. These are usually family members of Jewish Anders army soldiers. There's a few prominents, and among them are also these 1,000 or so Jewish children who are taken out of the Soviet Union as well. I want to emphasize, when I say that these people were saved by their deportations. I mean, their fate is only considered a good one in comparison to the other fate that would have been theirs under the Nazi occupation. But the conditions in the Soviet Union, and especially in Central Asia at this point in 1942, are just horrible. I mean, there's mass starvation and diseases that go with starvation. If you look, these are children who have just been evacuated to Iran, and this is what they look like. And you can see that they're in very bad shape, with severe malnutrition, with severe eye diseases, and many people died in Russia, and many children continue to die in Iran as well. So when these children are taken out of the Soviet Union or evacuated, they're evacuated without their parents. I mean, many people talk about the Tehran children as orphans, but most of them were in fact not orphans. It was just the case that their parents were not allowed to join them. So at this point in the game, they're not really a group. They are individual children who basically were sent off to their fate to avoid basically what their parents thought would be their death in Central Asia. In the case of my grandparents, they remained in Uzbekistan, and most Polish Jews remained in Central Asia for the duration of the war. Later on, conditions become a little bit better, and people do survive there quite a bit. In terms of the evacuation, about 116,000 Polish citizens are evacuated to Iran. Among these, there are about 40,000 civilians, and among these, there is a relatively small number of Jews, around 5,000 or 6,000. The numbers are very unclear, in part because there were also stowaways. There were also people who were able to bribe their way on the transports. There were fictitious marriages to Polish soldiers and so on. The children, this is actually a photo of basically Polish citizens, soldiers and otherwise, disembarking in Bandar Pahlavi, which is a port town in northern Iran. And you can see these children, civilian children embedded among them, but it's not anything organized. They're just all together there. In Iran, the Jewish children are quickly collected into something that became known as the Jewish Children's Home of Tehran. It's not really a home, it's just these tents and this structure. I should say that there are children as young as 2, they're toddlers, all the way up to about age 17. At this point, they are organized mostly by members of Hashomer HaTza'ir, the socialist Zionist movement. And these are basically young people, only slightly older than the children, who themselves were refugees and somehow made it to Iran. And they are organizing these children. What you see, these tents that you see are they're in the outskirts of Tehran. This is part of much larger Polish refugee camp, and the kind of children's home is at the edge of that. Eventually, in 1943, the children are evacuated along with their counselors and other adults. Again, if you look at the map, we were here in Iran, and eventually they're evacuated on British warships through the Persian Gulf, first to Karachi. And in Karachi, there are already many refugees are there as well, and they're there for several weeks, and then through the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal into Egypt, and by train into Palestine. I should say, if you look at the map, you can see that actually Tehran and Tel Aviv are very, very close. You can actually just take a car and take a ride for, I think, 48 hours and you'll be there. But in the middle was Iraq, and Iraq would not allow basically Jewish children openly to travel from Iran to Palestine at that point. The Arab-Jewish conflict was already at its height. In fact, we have the intervention of Eleanor Roosevelt, who is leaning on the Iraqi prime minister. And she's telling him, look, these are children. This is a humanitarian case. And he says that we're very sorry for these children. We will be happy to keep them in Iraq, but we're not going to let them pass to Palestine. So eventually they have to take this really treacherous and very torturous, and very scary route, because this part is completely full of German sea mines. But they do survive, and they arrive, as I said, in Palestine in February. This is February 1943. This was a very, it's kind of like the day that Kennedy died for Israelis of a certain age. People remember the day that the Tehran children came. I mean, we have to remember, this is February 1943. The Jewish community in Palestine still doesn't exactly know what's going on in Europe. I mean, it knows, but it doesn't know. And these are the first group of refugees and children that are coming as a group. And people are very excited and wild about them. And as I said, they are taken to kibbutzim and to other places around the country and the land, and that's where they're raised. The rest of the refugees, as I said, the ones who remained in Central Asia, remained there for the duration of the war. Eventually, there was, at the end of the war, there was a short window for them to repatriate to Poland. Most of them did. The classic route was that people returned to Poland, saw what they saw, experienced what they experienced, and very quickly left again, and ended up in displaced persons camps around Europe, mostly in Germany and Austria. That was the experience of my grandparents, and they stayed there for years. They stayed there for years and years. My grandfather died in Munich, in a displaced persons camp near Munich in 1949, and that a month later, my grandmother boarded a ship and joined her children in what was then already Israel. So the parents and the children were separated for 7 years. I think a very important and traumatic experience. So this is the general outline of my story, and which nonetheless had many unanswered questions. The first was the question of numbers, because the radically different numbers given by the Polish government and the Russian government and the Iranian government and the Jews and so on. So anywhere from 1.2 or even 2 million Polish exiles to 350,000, a number given by the Soviets. Secondly, the numbers and identities of how many people died in the Soviet Union and in those special settlements. So I traveled to those places, and I traveled to Komi and Arkhangelsk, and these are places that I mean, I'm sure there are several people here who research this, Russia and the Soviet Union. It's not exactly places where you could just travel, and I mean, these places are very Soviet still, more solemnly and hesitantly. She was 17, lived less than a half an hour away, and had never known such places existed. I mean, this place is huge, huge. The mosquitoes that zoomed overhead were merciless. Michael lit a cigarette. I began walking, and I walked for half an hour atop masses of corpses. Michael and Victor, another character there, stayed behind in the clearing. Stasia, the translator, leaned against the jeep and started crying. There were small mounds of individual graves and large mounds indicating mass burials. I lost my sense of direction and orientation. There were no names, no gravestones, just the raw earth and a handful of strong crosses. Once in a while, there would be an empty hole where perhaps the bones had been dug out. Individual gravestones were forbidden in the gulags and the special settlements, though occasionally a distinct number would be carved next to the burial site on a nearby tree, or a wooden pyramid, the half of a Star of David, that was the secret sign that Jewish deportees sometimes made for their dead. Anyway, I'll stop reading here. you know, I mean, I was hoping in the book to convey this sense of the mass scale of death and suffering, because in my own mind, and in the mind of many people, this was a kind of not so bad fate, right? But this was really not the case. Second, my book, I should say, and my travels are very much about the collaborations of Jews and non-Jews. First of all, I had collaborators and hosts in every one of these places. But also the story that I tell is, on the one hand, a Jewish story, and the fate of the Jewish refugees. But on the other hand, these fates converge and diverge from many other people, including all of my hosts. So everywhere I traveled, for example, this guy, Victor, I mean, his parents were deportees and so on, and in Uzbekistan and as well. So another important question that sent me to a real rabbit hole became the relationship between Jewish and Christian refugees, some of whom shared really the same fate and the same route, right? But my book, and in part this is why this story hasn't been told completely until now. As we know, those of us who work in the field of cultural memory, we know that cultural memory is national memory, that memory of the past is shaped by nations. And in some ways, this story is told, but very differently for each nation. For me, it was a story of the Jewish agency rescuing Jewish children and bringing them to Palestine. But in Poland, this is very much told as a story of Soviet aggression against the Polish nation. This is a monument to the murdered and fallen of the East, which also includes the murdered Polish officers in Katyn and other Polish refugees. But you can see this is a wagon with crosses on it. It doesn't, I mean, there is a small Star of David. You can't see it here, but it's in there. But it doesn't really account for the fact that many of the refugees, possibly more than half of the refugees, I mean, according to some people, were Jewish. So in some ways, this is, we know that we are living in a moment of contested memories and competition between memories and so on. But this was also particularly a story that question needed to be unpacked. And so that was something that I had to work through with testimonies and so on. Luckily, they're very good testimonies because the Polish government in exile took testimonies from Polish refugees in their places of exile. And even though those testimonies were very scripted, in other words, they had a kind of strict questionnaire that was really mostly engaged with the conditions in the Soviet Union, or the horrible conditions in the Soviet Union that the Polish government wanted to document. As is often with testimonies, a lot of other things made their way into the testimonies, including relationship in families and including Polish-Jewish relations. And there really was quite a bit of tension and even violence, especially in Iran. In Iran, circa 92, we have Polish nationalism that peaks. We also have members of the Zionist organizations coming to Poland, and in some ways we have that moment marks in some ways the separation of Jewish and Polish national identity. What else can I say? I should add also, in relationship to this question of the relationship between Poles and Jews, most of the Christian refugees, Polish refugees who were in Iran ended up in Palestine. And so in Palestine, in fact, we ended up having this kind of interesting reversal where the Jewish population of Palestine became the hosts of these Polish soldiers as well as Polish civilians. And I interviewed many of them who stayed in Palestine for a long time. Polish Christian children ended up in basically studied in Catholic schools across the land, and as well as in schools that were opened in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and elsewhere. And when we get to Palestine, these tensions, I think, from everything that I've researched, really diminish quite a bit. So my book, in some ways, charts very interesting, unexpected events, and maybe offers a slightly different view of history, at least a slightly different view of that I had as a kind of somewhat indoctrinated English professor, English graduate student who thinks about things in terms of colonialism, post-colonialism, and so on. And you have a lot of interesting reversals where Iranian Jews end up being the host of these European Jews, and and we have these interesting encounters that I write about. You have also interesting sort of networks that happen. For example, members of the Jewish Agency for Palestine come to Iran to basically aid these children and aid Jewish refugees and try to evacuate them to Palestine. When they get to Iran, they're thinking they're going to have a big operation, in part because they think many more refugees will be evacuated from the Soviet Union to Iran. However, that doesn't happen. These children get evacuated fairly quickly. We have some European refugees still in Iran, including refugees, by the way, from Germany and from Austria and other places in Europe. And we can talk about that later. These Zionist activists are realizing that their world has changed considerably. This is 1943. They're realizing that the people that they saw as the reserves of the Zionist movement, who were basically the youth who were in Poland, the Jewish youth who were part of the Zionist youth movements, they are realizing that they are being murdered, or they will be murdered. And they will be depleted. Those reserves will be depleted. They're realizing that people who were trapped in the Soviet Union may not be able to get out of there. And they're saying, who are going to be our reserves? And then they turn around and they say, well, we have local Jews, we have Iranian Jews right here. And they start working with local Jews, teaching Hebrew, doing activities, and so on. And that changes the kind of course of history in a way. I mean, and those Zionist activists write about that in their diaries, and they're writing about these encounters and those changes and so on in a very, very interesting way. So in many ways, my book offers maybe also a slightly different version or ideas about identities and about nationalities and how they're formed. I mean, I describe, I think, a world that's very dynamic, where the refugees change, but the host communities are also changed by the refugees themselves. There's a kind of contingent and fluctuating essence to what I describe, and at the same time, place is fate. So when I go to these places, and one of the things that I've realized is, if we go back to this by the way is this is a woman who I interviewed in Uzbekistan. She would have been a would-be Tehran child, only she met a guy, and this is how it usually happened, and she remained in Uzbekistan. She remains there at least she was there in 2013 when I was there. And she became Uzbek. And one thing that I realized is that if we go back to the map for a minute, sorry about that, is that along this route, along the route that I describe, every place of transit was an endpoint to many, many, many people, for whatever reason, whether they weren't released or they were released, and they said people were released from gulags and settlements, and they said, we just don't have the strength to continue, and they remained there. And became trapped behind the Iron Curtain, then became Soviets, Russians. People remained in Uzbekistan, people remained in Iran. And since my book came out, people have been writing me and saying, I mean, I knew people remained there. People actually they say, oh, you know, my mother was Polish and my father was Iranian and she remained in Iran and so on. So the whole notion of this really made me question what I think about as identity, what I think about fate, and so on. Perhaps I will stop here just with a kind of summary, and that the book is, and this is where Derek started, the book is a kind of, in many ways, an intimate history of my father, but also a really big history, in a way, of the world. I have, my book is being translated to German, and yesterday the German editor actually wrote me, and he said, Michal, your father's story is that of the German Tatar, of Russians who were hostile to Jewish refugees, of Polish Red Cross supporters, of the British who are still administering Persia, Iranians and Jews throughout the Middle East. The story of the little boy Hanan contains, like a kernel of nuts, almost the entire drama of the 20th century. And I think, you know, he put it very nicely, and in some ways, I think that's what the book tries to do as well, in a way to show that you know, personal history and collective history or global history, including the history of empires and nations, are not really separated from each other and can be told together. So thank you.
Thank you. Marvelous presentation, marvelous book. And I'm going to turn to the floor. One is, if you could just talk a little bit more. I think people here, we have a very good crowd, 54 people here, would appreciate hearing a little bit more about the relationship between Britain and Iran, because it's not like Iraq. Iraq had been a mandatory territory, and then it becomes independent, but it has a pro-British monarch. The relationship between Britain and Iran is a little bit more complicated, and I wonder if you could explain basically why why each of those parties agreed to this, to have the refugees come into Iran, and then how they were received by the Muslim population of Iran.
Right. So as you know, many of you know, so Iran is Iran and World War II is a complex. There's a complex answer there, right? So we know that in 1939, Iran is a neutral state with but the Shah, who is at the kind of the father of the Shah that we will later know, is very much has many business ties to Germany. I mean, basically German engineers are modernizing Iran in the 1920s and 30s, and that relationship doesn't really stop when Hitler rises to power. So Iran, but at the same time, Iran is letting in Jewish refugees, German Jewish refugees and German Austrian refugees, starting from the rise of Hitler, starting from the 1930s. And they're simply letting them in as Germans under certain professional categories, engineers, lawyers, musicians, for some reason, and so on. And they are allowed to come in so they can basically continue doing what other non-Jewish Germans are doing. And so there is that community is already there since the 1930s. At the same time, we have in Iran, starting in late 1930s into the beginning of the war, pro-Nazi Shiite clerics. You have racist publications. You have actually Gestapo in Tehran. So all of these exist together. As we know, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Allies basically invade Iran, but depose the former Shah, who was seen as more pro-German, and instead of annoying his son, who's 23-year-old son, who is much more pro-British. And at that point, that is basically the point that the refugees come, that the Polish refugees come. Of course, we also know that Tehran is divided between different areas of control, Soviet and British and so on. So that basically enables the population to, that enables the population to receive these refugees. The reception is extremely hospitable. Granted that the Jews among the Poles are just basically, I mean, they're not identified as Jews. I mean, they're part of this big group. Even today, when many Iranians who know the story don't, non-Jewish Iranians know that, think about this as they think about the Poles. They don't think about the different distinctions. Very spontaneously, they're just wonderful descriptions and I write about in the book as well, even of that the children describe. One of my best sources was a travel diary that I had of a child who was born in Warsaw and wrote a travel diary, and he just describes these spontaneous instances of people, a man going to a candy stall and just buying all the candy and giving it to the children, or people start crying when they see them. I mean, they really look horrible. And there's some, so the reception was in general, at least in the beginning, very, very positive. Then I also said the Persian Jewish community, some people in the Persian Jewish community, together actually with German Jewish refugees and Iraqi Jewish and other refugee groups who are in Tehran, organized to help the children as well. And this is, so that's another part of the story, the story of the Persian Jewish community that in some ways organizes itself in ways that it hadn't organized previously, because it is now organizing to help these people. So so this becomes possible after about a year, or even less than a year. There begins to be tremendous price hikes and problems with black market, and there's a lot more pressure to get the refugees out of Iran. But the fact is that there is no violence against them. There is no, there's the kind of fear that something will happen, but nothing happens, basically.
Fantastic. Well, there's a lot of questions. So two questions are similar. You referred briefly to Hashomer HaTzair, the most leftist or whatever, Marxist of the kibbutz movements, later became the political party Mapam. So they're active in Iran. You mentioned the Sochnut, the Jewish agency. So there's a couple of people who would like to know here about exactly how this evacuation process was initiated and organized. Was it something like the Kindertransport, from Germany to England in the 1930s? So yeah, it's a couple of questions really very similar about how this was organized and who took initiatives.
Okay, great question. So we have to realize there is a war, and there is the kind of quasi-government, Jewish government in Palestine, right, which is the Jewish Agency of Palestine. You have Jewish American aid organizations, mostly the Joint Distribution Commission, sitting in New York, and everybody's watching these refugees. They know about them already when they're in the settlements and the gulags, because people are allowed to write letters, but they can't do anything about it. But they're sort of watching them very intently. The moment they are released, they start looking for ways to help them and to evacuate them and to send aid and so on. And I worked extensively in those archives, and that's a big part of my book. When they are evacuated to Iran, when these children are evacuated to Iran, I mean, those people in Palestine and in New York know about them, and they're looking to see what they can do. But it's not, of course, not so easy, because, I mean, you have a situation where nobody really wants particularly to evacuate those people, even out of the Soviet Union. The Soviet government says, well, the Jews are not the Poles. the Poles don't particularly want the Jews to get out of the Soviet Union and then go back to Poland after the war. The British don't want to evacuate them because they're thinking, they'll end up in Palestine, and there's already kind of, the tensions will increase, and especially they don't want Andres army soldiers to get there, Jewish Andres army soldiers. And so, nonetheless, there's diplomacy and a lot of stuff going on underground. What we have is the the Joint Distribution Commission working diplomatically with the Polish government in exile, with the American forces, with British and so on. And you have the Jews of Palestine who basically come to Iran, first of all, clandestinely. The way they come is this. One of the reasons why, I mean, this is a lot of information, but, nonetheless. Britain, of course, one of the reasons it invades Iran is for oil, right? We have the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The minute it invades Iran, the German engineers who are working in those areas are kicked out. And there is a kind of vacuum of workforce, and Churchill, I mean, the question is, who's going to come? So Churchill says, well, we have the Jews of Palestine, we have engineers, we'll bring them here. And so many of those people come, about 500 people come to Iran, and some of them basically double up as clandestine Jewish agency agents, and they start organizing the kids and so on. There's a lot of diplomacy happening in London with basically Moshe Sharet, who was the so-called foreign minister in a way, or head of the foreign department of the Jewish Agency of Palestine. At the end, this is made possible. I mean, it's very complicated, the journey. I mean, it gets organized and it gets canceled and so on. So this, on this journey, nothing happens without basically a lot of players and a lot of diplomacy, a lot of money that is going on. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. Now, I should say also that it's the people who come from Palestine. A lot of them they're part of something called Mossad L'Aliyah Bet. It's a kind of clandestine immigration arm. And they sacrifice their lives. I mean, some of them, they try to get into the Soviet Union, basically. They try to actually get refugees out of the Soviet Union, and they try to cross the border, and they can't cross the border because the Soviets are guarding the border, and they get shot, and then they send another to death, and they send another person, and so on. So it's a kind of heroic rescue operation in some ways, but in other ways, it's not. When the children are in Iran, they're already safe. Let's put it that way.
Amazing. Yehuda Shenhav has written interesting things on the Soldel Bonnet as people who wind up in Iraq, but that's a related story, a little different. Anyway, another really interesting question is about about reception. This is a question. Can you talk a bit about the sort of reception the children got in the various countries they transited through? So maybe not in Iran itself, but in India, there's a faint memory of some 4,000 Polish children being hosted by the Raja of Jamnagar for some 18 months.
Yeah, I think I did a lot of work in India, and Tina Grossman, the historian, is working on India a lot more than I have. But yes, there was quite wonderful reception in India with the Raj. There was a family called the Sassoon family. It was a Jewish family, and when the Jewish children get there, they immediately, trucks come into the camp and they start bringing them hats and food and I mean, their memories and what children write in their testimonies and mostly in their memoirs in older life about Karachi are just wonderful. I mean, some of them are just almost on vacation and they're going to go, so they see elephants and so on. So, but there was a warm reception. There's a very moving, I think a very moving anecdote that is told by one of the children, where they stop on their way in Aden. Basically, they spend a couple of nights in Aden, Yemen, and the children are told, look, this is this is an Arab country. This is going to be very dangerous for you. You have to hide, basically, go down below and hide. And of course, they're children, so they don't do what they're told. So they all go on deck, start running around, and all around them, these local children stand on shore, and they're like screaming. They're just screaming to them for food. They're asking for food. And one of the children wrote, it's the first time we saw children that looked worse than us. So they go down below to the deck, they get food from the kitchen, and they start throwing them food, and these children are diving into the water to get the food. And there are these very precious moments like that are described along their journey. There are, of course, also very difficult things as well, including in not so much by host populations. I mean, maybe here and there, especially in Uzbekistan and in Central Asia, when tensions rise. And there are also different periods, right? So yes, I mean, there's some difficult instances, but for the most part, I would say, in the grand scheme of things, they survived in those places. And if they died, they didn't die because of hostilities. They died because of diseases.
That's thank you. There's a question that you partially answered, but maybe you want to talk a little bit more about it. There's a question that says, the Jewish residents one meets today in Tashkent, Bukhara, Samarkand, to what extent are they descendants of these Tehran children who never made it out from earlier migrations?
Yes, some of them are descendants. Many people, most Jews in general, left, they left those areas after Uzbek independence, right? But many, yes, some of them definitely are those descendants. Some of them I don't necessarily identify as Jewish. But when I was in Uzbekistan, my helper, my clandestine research assistant, was a Korean Uzbek, because Koreans were also exiled to Uzbekistan, and he was incredibly devoted to helping me. He was devoted more than just a person who I was, paying to help me. And one of the reasons that he was devoted was that he had gone to school in Tashkent, and all his classmates were Jewish, were basically the sons and daughters and grandchildren of these refugees, but also evacuees, right? Because there were also evacuees from Russian evacuees from Moscow and so on. So he knew them intimately, and he knew these stories intimately. So yes, I mean, some of them are still there. I visited, as I said, I interviewed some people. There are some famous artists. Ultimately, Tashkent and Samarkand during the war were incredibly interesting places with incredibly interesting people there doing incredibly interesting things, including productions of Yiddish theater in Uzbek, stuff like that.
Let's see, we've got some more questions. So here's a question from someone whose father was from Tehran and grew up in a neighborhood that was quite diverse, an affluent neighborhood, and where Persian and Jews and Christians also lived. He remembers the arrival of the Tehran children, along with other Polish refugees. The question is, did any of the Tehran children, because of their experience in Iran, did that then have any effect on their later political affiliations? Did any of them speak in favor of, warm relations between Israel and Iran? And that gets into the subject of Israel-Iran relations, which have undergone major shifts over the last 70 years. But I think it's a really interesting question.
Right. Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I mean, part of my problem doing this, like many people who do these quest narratives, I did it too late, right? So a lot of people are really, a lot of the kind of the people who are the older children in Iran, including my father, are no longer with us. I mean, I did interview, there's a woman by the name of Tamar Peleg, who was human rights lawyer in Israel, and also working working with Palestinians and so on, and who was in Iran, and she told me, you know, that really influenced my worldview being in Iran. I wouldn't say that I have seen a lot of that per se, but at the same time, certainly people have very sort of fond memories, good memories of their stay in Iran. We have to remember also, and as Derek said, that there have been all these different stages of the relationship between Iran and Israel, including, and this is something that begins with, again, with the Tehran children. As I told you, we have basically the Zionists coming to Iran, members of the Jewish Agency of Palestine, which eventually stay there sort of openly, so they don't hide anymore. And they start cultivating relationship with the Shah. So in 1943, 44, I think there's a kind of meeting, and a present, they present a present to him, and we start getting the beginning of these warm relationships that end up in a situation where in the 1960s and 70s you have tens of thousands of Israelis actually working in Iran in various jobs and so on. So they're very warm ties until 1979. So, you know, I don't know that these people's political views were changed, but I think that their arrival actually enabled this historical trajectory that took place from then on. And, you know, and I think it will return. I mean, there's been a lot of response to my book from Iranians, including an Iranian media company in London that has now made a short film about the book, about a kind of 20-minute film, and they want to use it for Holocaust education in Iran, and they have the ways, I guess, of getting into Iran, or at least to getting it to Iranian exiles and so on. So certainly there is interest on both sides.
I was wondering about something, you know, you mentioned briefly that Polish reactions to the book can sometimes be a bit prickly, but it is, I mean, it's just a fact. It's not, I mean, I know we're living in a post-fact universe, but it really is a fact that the overwhelming majority of Polish Jews who survived the war survived because they were not in Poland. That is, those who stayed in Poland, most of them died. And it's interesting to me how in your, you know, maybe in your interactions with people who have Polish nationalist views, I mean, how can they simply deny this reality that the Jews who stayed in Poland overwhelmingly were killed? And, you know, as you said, life was miserable for them in Central Asia, but they had a much better chance of surviving.
Right. I mean, I think, I mean, as you know, we were in a very tense period in that regard, because you have active effort to suppress historians and so on by the Polish government, who are working on these things, and an active attempt to offer a different narrative, than we're used to. And that narrative doesn't deny that the Jews were, of course it doesn't, I don't think there's any attempt to deny that 90% of Polish Jews were killed, but I think there is an attempt to sort of say, well, you know, we were victims as well, and this was done, I mean, this was the work basically of the Nazis, and it had nothing to do with Poles. And the Poles were victims also, and there were victims in my story as well. And I tried, and I think that's kind of the tragedy, because I think I tried very hard to represent that as well, that Jews didn't have a monopoly on suffering in this story, because it's a story of a lot of people, but nonetheless, they suffered in a particular way. So the people who are upset with me, I guess, feel like my emphasis, I mean, two things. First of all, and the emphasis on basically things that, again, things that are supported by the archives that I can't change. I wish I could change. That, for example, in the distribution of aid in Iran, the Jewish children basically received less aid, less sweaters, less worse food, and so on. And that is something that in the children themselves describe in the testimonies. There is a very, very detailed report that where even people, even members of the Jewish, of the American Red Cross and so on, and say, well, we look at these two groups of children and they just don't look the same, and these children just look much worse. I think it's, I mean, there is an orchestrated government part that's really terrible. And there is also, I think, individual people who feel like their own suffering is being denied. And I really try not to do that, because I do think that it's important to, I mean, the book, I always say the book, to the extent that it can, practices radical empathy. It goes as far as it can in the sense, because I think people had, you know, these Polish children in Iran ultimately actually had terrible fates, because they couldn't return, they never returned to Poland. In some ways, the Jewish children end up having a homeland in some way, and the Polish children end up in New Zealand and other places. And so I try not to make it a competition of suffering, but I also try to make it, to stick to the facts, and I don't make it pretty, prettier than it is. So it's some people don't like that, but I think most people who are upset with me actually haven't read the book. I mean, they just have all kinds of ideas and knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, I mean, that happens whenever you write about a sensitive subject, as I know that either people don't read the book, or I'm convinced they read every other word or every other line. I got to tell you, your book came out right at the same time as Adam Teller. He had a book called Rescue the Surviving Souls. And it's really the story of your book, but in 1648. It's about the great refugee crisis of the Chmielnicki massacres and the Polish Cossack-Russian wars of sort of 1648 to about 1660. And you've got death and misery and Jews who are refugees. And it's really all about how they get to where they're going, how they're received. And the one thing that unites the two books, aside from this common story, is the politics of rescue. That although Jews in that time, I mean, the Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews are literally in two different worlds, and yet this is the one thing they can agree on. You know, the one thing they can agree on is that if Jews are taken captive, they have to be ransomed, and the Jews do, you know, there's these certain basic charitable impulses. And it struck me, here we are, you know, 300 years later in your book. And the story of the politics of rescue that you referred to, you know, a few minutes ago, that they really have the deck stacked against them. They're dealing with powerful countries. You know, the British are not known for their love of getting Jews out of Central Asia and possibly to Palestine. You mentioned, I mean, there's no state power that really wants to help these Jews. And yet somehow, you know, the JDC, the Sochnut, Solel Bonnet, whatever, they somehow pull it together. It's an amazing story of a non-state actor taking on states at the worst possible moment and engaging in a politics of rescue. So I found the book in a weird way uplifting, that aspect of it at least.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you're right. I mean, it's so impressive to read that and to see what they did, because just even on the pragmatic level, I mean, when these people are released from the camps and the gulags, there's immediately thinking, how are we going to keep them alive? What medicines do they need? And you have to be very smart about it, right? I mean, what are you going to give for typhus, and what are you going to give for malaria? And they have doctors in Weill Cornell who are making lists, and you have to think about costs, and you have to think about how to get it to them. And of course, you have to think that most of it will be stolen anyway along the way. So you have to have enough quantity so that whatever 10% gets to the refugees will get. So it is very impressive. And, you know, people often ask me, who's the hero in your book? And I say, the hero in my book is collaboration and pragmatism. And I think that's really true. They're working against state actors. They're not always successful, but they're successful a lot of the times because they, exactly as you say, they're able to put their differences aside. Even the JDC and the Jewish Agency of Palestine, these are groups with very different politics and very different aims. And, at some point, the head of Mossad L'Aliyah Bet, Shaul Mayrov, who's basically this guy who is involved with this, and he's making these lists of how to help people and so on. And he says that they're making these lists because they know of members of Zionist movements who are in Central Asia. And at some point, and his people tell him, you're going to just surrender these lists to the JDC and they'll get all the credit for rescuing people. And he says, that's not about that now. We have our aims, they have their aims, and so it's beyond ego and so on. I mean, it's not, again, there are hard moments and there are all kinds of problems and wrong paths that people go on and then have to change it, but it's very impressive for sure. And it is uplifting in that sense.
There's one very quick final question has come in. You mentioned interest in Iran. Are there plans to translate the book into Farsi?
There is. So my colleague Salar Abdah, who is a novelist and who himself actually just published a wonderful novel, was in Iran. He was actually trying to make this happen because in part, the fear is that if you don't actually get a reputable publisher to publish it, then this book will be taken and all the irrelevant parts will be taken out, and then it'll become a kind of, in a way, some ways, a propaganda tool. But so far we haven't been able to do it because, of course, now is such a period of tenseness between Iran and America and Israel. And so we're trying. It may be that we're going to have it translated by a Persian press in Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it is being translated now to German and to Hebrew, possibly to Polish. It's under review, and I'm hoping to Persian as well. But there will be, I should say that on December 8th, there'll be a big event for the book by the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., in conjunction with the Chautauqua Literary Institute. And the part that the Holocaust Museum will focus on Iran and the Holocaust. So there will be a panel and a bunch of professors and so on. So I think there is an attempt to highlight the story and to reach Persian audiences through the story.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the essence of the book, your own insights today. I hope that everyone here gets a copy. It is a wonderful book. And just Michal, a technical note, but we had a technical change, and you will be the one who has to press the button that says leave meeting because you are now the co-host. But I just want to thank all of you for coming. I hope you enjoyed an hour and 15 minutes distraction from scrolling on your phones to see what the Washington Post has to say. So far as I know, by the way, at least an hour ago, the news was good. So in any case, there will be one more Modern Jewish History seminar on December 2nd. Shmuel Feiner will be here from Bar Ilan University speaking about the Jewish 18th century and why 1782 is the year when modern Jewish history began. So hope to see you at that talk. And again, thank you, Michal, and thank you, Vasilis and Michael, as always, for making this possible.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your questions. And Derek, thank you. It was just such a pleasure.
You're welcome.